The night on Zyphora Station was quiet. The human colony had been built on the edge of a vast alien forest, where tall silver trees stretched their branches like frozen lightning against the sky. The stars above burned brighter than anywhere on Earth, and Daniel Hayes often found himself standing at the window of his quarters, staring at them. He was not a soldier. He was not a leader. He was an engineer, someone who came to fix broken communication towers, calibrate weather shields, and keep the outpost running. For months, he lived a life of routine. Work during the day, small talk with a few other colonists, and long evenings, spent alone in his room. Daniel liked the silence. It reminded him of home. But on this night, silence brought something unexpected. The door to his quarters slid open without warning. Daniel turned sharply, expecting to see a fellow worker or maybe a guard. Instead, someone else entered. A woman. She was barefoot. Her steps made no sound against the metal floor. She wore a long robe woven with patterns unlike anything human hands could make. The fabric shimmered faintly in the light. Then, without a word, she let the robe fall to the ground. Daniel froze. Beneath the robe, she wore simple garments made of soft alien cloth, almost like linen. They were plain, not rich or decorated, and they seemed travel-worn. She stood tall, her posture calm, her eyes bright with something unreadable. And then she smiled. No words, no sound, just a smile. Daniel's first thought was that this was some kind of test, or worse, a trap. The colonists had always been told to keep their distance from the native clans of this world. Relations were fragile, balanced between small trade agreements and old distrust. For one of them to walk straight into his quarters, it was unthinkable. Who are you?" Daniel asked carefully. The woman tilted her head slightly but said nothing. Her smile remained soft but steady like a lantern in the dark. She did not reach for a weapon. She did not move closer. She simply stood there, as if waiting for him to understand something he could not see. Daniel's pulse quickened. He bent to pick up the robe she had dropped. The fabric was surprisingly heavy, with strange symbols stitched along the hem. It smelled faintly of herbs and smoke, as though it had passed through fire. He looked back at her. She hadn't moved an inch. "You're not supposed to be here," he whispered. Still nothing, just the quiet smile. Daniel's mind raced. Should he call security? Report this to the command office? Or would that put her in danger? He remembered hearing rumors about certain clans practicing old rituals, sending envoys in strange ways. Could this be one of those rituals? Was she here as a message? The silence stretched. Finally, Daniel sighed and set the robe aside. "All right," he muttered. "If you're here, then I guess you have your reasons." He motioned for her to sit. She shook her head gently, as if to refuse, but stepped farther into the room. She glanced around, studying his tools, his scattered repair notes, the half-finished transmitter on his desk. Then she looked back at him, her eyes clear and calm. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "You can't stay here. People will notice." Her answer was another smile, so small and so certain that it unsettled him more than any weapon could have. The next morning, Daniel convinced himself it had been a dream. Maybe he had fallen asleep at his desk. Maybe stress and long nights had played tricks on his mind. But when he stepped out of his room, he saw the robe folded neatly by the door. His breath caught. It was real. She had been there. During the day, he worked on the weather shield panels near the edge of the colony. He tried to bury the thought, focusing on cables, circuits, and the usual problems. But the image of her smile kept returning. A silent figure, barefoot, unafraid, standing in his room as though she had always belonged there. When night came again, Daniel secured the door, double-checked the locks, and even kept a tool near his hand, just in case. Hours passed. He read reports, adjusted a schematic, and told himself nothing would happen. Then, just as before, the door slid open. She entered. Barefoot again. No sound in her steps. The same calm presence. This time, Daniel stood quickly. "Why are you here?" he asked firmly. No reply. She set something down on his table, a small pouch woven with fine thread. Inside were dried fruits, unfamiliar but sweet-smelling. She pushed it gently toward him, then clasped her hands together as if offering it. Daniel blinked. "You brought this for me?" She nodded slowly. A gift. A gesture. Daniel hesitated, then picked up one of the fruits and tasted it. It was unlike anything he had eaten, sharp but refreshing. The woman's smile widened as though she was pleased. "Okay," Daniel said, sighing. "So you can't, or won't, speak, but you understand me." Her eyes sparkled. That night, Daniel realized something important. She wasn't here by accident. She had chosen to walk into his room to bring him something, to smile instead of threaten. She was building something without words, trust, and Daniel, against all reason, decided not to report her. The following evenings followed the same rhythm. She would appear without warning, barefoot, leaving behind silence and simple gestures. Sometimes she placed small objects on his desk, stones shaped like moons, herbs that glowed faintly when crushed, a wooden carving of a bird. Other times she simply sat nearby while he worked, watching him with quiet curiosity. Daniel learned to accept her presence. He even began talking out loud, as though she could answer. "This circuit should keep the tower online another month," he explained one night. She leaned closer, studying the wires, her brow furrowed with interest. When he burned his hand on a hot cable, she was the one who quickly poured cool water from the jug she carried. She pressed a cloth against his skin, her touch light and careful. No words, just action. Bit by bit, the silence between them grew less heavy. But outside his quarters, the colony was restless. Some had spotted strange tracks near the fences. Others claimed to see shadows moving at night. Tension between humans and the alien clans was rising again. Daniel knew that if anyone discovered her visits, it could spark disaster. Yet every time she walked through his door, barefoot, robe discarded, smile unbroken, he felt an unspoken truth. She wasn't his enemy. She was a message. The only question was whether he would understand it before it was too late. The days at Sci-Fi station followed a rhythm Daniel had grown used to, but now there was a new rhythm woven into his life, her visits. Every night, the silent woman appeared at his door. Every night she walked in barefoot, set aside her robe, and stayed without a word. At first, Daniel told himself he should stop her. He should call security, alert the command office, or at least demand answers. But the truth was simpler. He didn't want to. Something about her presence steadied him, like the calm after a storm. She brought gifts, always small and strange. One night it was a handful of glowing blue seeds that pulsed faintly like tiny stars. Another time it was a smooth piece of metal etched with designs that looked like flowing rivers. Once, she even brought a flask of sweet liquid that tasted like honey mixed with mint. Daniel would accept each gift, unsure whether they were tokens of friendship, trade, or something deeper. She never spoke, but she always smiled. One evening, after a long day repairing the shield generators on the colonies, Daniel sat at his desk with sore hands. The woman entered as usual, carrying nothing this time. She simply sat near his table, folding her hands in her lap. Daniel glanced at her. "You're not going to tell me who you are you?" Her smile answered for her. "You understand me, though," Daniel said. "I can see it in your eyes. You're not lost. You're not confused. You're here because you want to be." She tilted her head, her eyes soft. Daniel sighed. He picked up a small tool and began adjusting a broken transmitter. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was like working while a quiet song played in the background, something steady and reassuring. Suddenly, he pricked his finger on a sharp wire. "Ow!" He pulled back, blood beading on his skin. Before he could reach for a cloth, she was already at his side. She took his hand gently, her touch careful. She pressed a piece of soft fabric against the cut. The fabric had been hidden in her sleeve, and it smelled faintly of herbs. Daniel froze. He could feel how steady her hands were. No rush, no fear. She tied the cloth around his finger, then released him. When he looked up, her smile was still there, but softer this time, almost tender. "Thank you," he whispered. She nodded, as though that was enough. The next night, Daniel decided to try something different. He brought out a notebook and a pencil. When she entered, he held up the pencil and pointed to himself. "Daniel," he said slowly, writing his name on the page. He turned the notebook toward her. For a moment, she stared at it. Then she reached out, took the pencil with surprising care, and drew a simple shape. A bird with wide wings. She didn't write a word, but her drawing was clear. She pointed to herself, then to the bird. Daniel frowned. "Bird? That's your name?" She gave a tiny nod. He wasn't sure if that was her real name or just the best way she could explain it. But from that night on in his mind, she became Bird. Bird. Never wrote letters, never formed words on the page, but she drew. Symbols, animals, patterns. Sometimes she would point to one and then to the world outside, as if telling him stories through pictures. Daniel found himself looking forward to it every day. After work, he would hurry back to his quarters, wondering what picture she would leave him this time. Outside, however, tension in the colony was rising. Scouts reported movement in the forests. Some said the alien clans were gathering again, whispering about broken agreements. Command grew uneasy. Guards doubled their patrols. Daniel heard the talk at the mess hall. "They're planning something," one soldier muttered. "I saw their firelights in the hills." "Maybe they're just watching us," another argued, "waiting to see what we'll do." Either way, suspicion spread like fire, and Daniel felt the weight of a secret pressing harder on him. Every night, Bird walked into his quarters without fail. If anyone saw her, if anyone even guessed, what would they do to her? That fear followed him, but so did her smile. One late evening, as the stars glowed bright through the windows, Daniel asked her the question that had haunted him. "Why me?" he said softly. "Why do you keep coming here?" Bird only looked at him, her eyes filled with quiet strength. Then, slowly, she reached out her hand and placed it over his chest, just above his heart. Daniel froze. She tapped once, then pulled her hand back. Her smile deepened. Daniel swallowed hard. He didn't know exactly what it meant, but he felt the message. She trusted him. Out of everyone, she had chosen him. And for the first time in months, Daniel didn't feel so alone. The following night, Bird did something new. She arrived with a small satchel slung across her shoulder. From it, she pulled out strands of dried herbs, small crystals, and a carved wooden disc. She spread them on Daniel's table, arranging them in a pattern. Daniel leaned closer. "What's this?" She pointed at the disc, then at him. Then she pressed her hand flat against the table, as though telling him to stay calm. He didn't understand at first, but as she worked, he realized she was building something, a message, or maybe a ritual. She laid the herbs in a circle, placed the crystals at 4 points, and set the disc in the center. Then she looked up at him, waiting. Daniel hesitated. "Do you want me to touch it?" She nodded once. With careful hands, Daniel placed his fingers on the wooden disc. It was warm, though he hadn't seen her heat it. A faint hum ran through his skin, not painful, just strange. Bird closed her eyes, her lips moving silently. Though she made no sound, Daniel felt as if the room itself had gone still, like the world was holding its breath. Then she opened her eyes again and smiled. Daniel pulled his hand back slowly. "I don't know what that was," he whispered, "but I think I understand." Bird tilted her head as though asking him what he understood. Daniel let out a breath. "You're not here to harm us. You're here to connect." Her eyes shone, and for the first time she gave a small nod of agreement. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about her. Bird had no voice, no words, yet she had spoken louder than anyone else he had ever met. He remembered her hand on his chest. He remembered the warmth of the wooden disc. And he remembered the way she smiled, as though nothing could shake her calm. But he also remembered the rumors, the whispers of soldiers, the fear in the colony. If they discovered her, everything would collapse. Daniel sat up, heart heavy with a decision he hadn't made yet. Should he tell someone the truth? Or should he keep her secret, even if it meant risking his own safety? He didn't know the answer yet. All he knew was this: Bird had chosen him, and whether he was ready or not, that choice had already changed his life. The colony was restless. Rumors had begun to move through the air like smoke, curling into every corner of Sci-Fi Station. At first, Daniel ignored them. He told himself the soldiers were only exaggerating, that the talk of shadows in the forests and strange tracks by the fence was nothing more than paranoia. But then the whispers grew louder. One evening, while he was working on a generator unit, he overheard two guards speaking. "They say one of the clans is testing us," one muttered, eyes darting toward the trees, leaving signs near the colony just to see how close they can get before we notice. The other frowned. Or maybe they've already come inside. The words made Daniel's stomach tighten. He forced himself to stay focused on the wires in front of him, but his hands felt clumsy. He knew who they were talking about. Bird. That night when she came, he shut the door quickly behind her. His voice was sharper than usual. "Do you know what's happening out there?" he asked. Bird looked at him calmly as if the question carried no weight. She didn't speak, but she tilted her head and raised her hand, drawing a shape in the air. It was the same symbol she had once traced in his notebook, a simple circle with two crossing lines. Daniel recognized it. It was the old sign for peace, one of the first symbols shared during the early talks between humans and her people. He swallowed. "Peace? You're trying to keep peace?" She nodded gently. Daniel rubbed his forehead. "Then why are they so restless? Why are there tracks near the fences? Why are the soldiers talking about war again?" Bird did not answer. She only drew the circle again, pressing her palm over it as if to remind him. Her silence was more powerful than words, but it didn't erase his fear. The next morning, Daniel was called into the command office. A tall officer named Mercer stood with arms crossed. His eyes narrowed when he looked at Daniel. "You work on the western sector, don't you?" Mercer asked. Daniel nodded cautiously. "Yes, sir." Mercer leaned closer. "You haven't seen anything unusual at night? No strangers? No movement near your quarters?" Daniel forced his voice to stay steady. "No, sir. Just the usual maintenance work." The officer's gaze lingered, as if weighing every word. "Be careful. If you see anything at all, you're to report it immediately. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Daniel replied, though his heart was pounding. He left the office with sweat prickling the back of his neck. The pressure was closing in. How long before someone noticed Bird? That evening, Daniel returned to his quarters and found Bird already there. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor, her robe folded neatly beside her. She looked up as he entered, her smile warm as always, but Daniel's expression was heavy. "You can't keep coming here," he said firmly. "People are asking questions. They're watching me. If they see you—" He stopped, unable to finish. Bird tilted her head, her eyes filled with calm understanding. She stood and walked toward him. With slow hands, she reached for his notebook on the desk. She drew quickly, her strokes sure and clear, two figures standing apart, with flames between them. Then she drew the circle again, over the flames, pressing her palm against it. Daniel stared at the image. "The clans and the colony. Fire between us. And you. You want to stop it." Her eyes lit up with relief that he understood. Daniel sank into his chair, running his hand through his hair. "You're asking me to help you, but I don't even know how. I'm just an engineer. I fix wires, I patch machines. I'm not a diplomat." Bird stepped closer and gently placed her hand on his shoulder. She didn't need words. Her message was clear. She believed in him. Over the next few nights, her visits carried a new urgency. She no longer brought small gifts or trinkets. Instead, she sketched maps on his notebook, rough drawings of forests, rivers, and mountain passes. She pointed to certain places, then shook her head as if warning him. Daniel pieced it together slowly. There were patrols moving in the woods. Her clan was watching the colony, maybe even preparing to act, but she wanted to prevent bloodshed. One night she pressed her hands together in a gesture like pleading. Then she drew a line from the clan's territory to the colony walls, crossing it with the circle of peace. "You want me to carry this message?" Daniel whispered. Bird nodded. He stared at her in disbelief. "If I tell them, they won't listen. They'll think it's a trick. And if they find out you've been here all along..." Bird's eyes softened. She raised her hand again and tapped his chest right above his heart. Just as she had before. Daniel's chest tightened. She was trusting him with everything. One night, the risk nearly became reality. A soldier named Brant, known for his suspicion and temper, stopped Daniel outside his quarters. "You've been keeping to yourself a lot," Brant said coldly. "People are starting to wonder why." Daniel forced a small smile. "I just like my work. I'm not much for crowds." Brant's eyes narrowed. He glanced toward Daniel's door. "Strange noises near your room last night. You sure you're alone in there?" Daniel's heart hammered. "Just my tools. I've been working late on a transmitter." Brant leaned closer. "If I find out you're hiding something, Hayes, it won't end well for you. Or for anyone else." Daniel kept his face calm until Brant walked away. Then he rushed into his room, locking the door. Bird stood there, silent as always, but her eyes asked the question. Daniel nodded grimly. "They're watching me. We have to be more careful." Bird stepped closer and touched his hand gently, her smile unwavering. Her calmness steadied him even as fear clawed at his chest. The next night, Daniel reached a decision. He placed the Sci-Fi notebook on the table and spoke clearly even though she never answered aloud. "I'll help you," he said. "I'll find a way to tell them. But you need to promise me something, too. You can't be seen here anymore. Not until I figure this out." Bird's smile faded into something softer, almost sad. She hesitated, then nodded once. Daniel felt a strange ache in his chest. He had grown used to her silent visits, to the comfort of her presence. The thought of her not walking barefoot into his room, not leaving her robe on the floor, not smiling quietly. It left the room feeling colder already. But it had to be done. Bird picked up her robe and draped it over her shoulders. She paused, by the door, looking back at him one last time that night. Her smile returned, small but steady. Then she stepped into the shadows and was gone. Daniel sat alone, the silence heavier than it had ever been. Outside, the whispers of danger grew louder. Soldiers sharpened their weapons. Scouts whispered of movement in the trees. And deep down, Daniel knew. Bird was right. A storm was coming. And whether he was ready or not, he was standing at the center of it. The colony grew more tense with every passing day. Patrols doubled around the perimeter fences. Searchlights swept the forests at night, and soldiers whispered about war that might begin at any moment. Daniel felt the weight of every rumor, because he knew the truth hiding inside his quarters. Bird was not an enemy spy. She was not here to plot against them. She was the only thread of peace still holding the two sides together. But now, she had vanished. For 2 nights, she didn't come. Daniel sat alone in his room, staring at the folded notebook full of her drawings. The silence was heavier than ever. He found himself waiting for the soft sound of the door sliding open, for the sight of her barefoot steps, for her calm smile. But nothing came. He worried she had been caught. Or worse, that her own people had discovered what she was doing and punished her for it. On the 3rd night, just as Daniel was preparing to sleep, the door finally opened. Bird slipped inside, robe around her shoulders, her face pale and strained. She closed the door quickly and pressed her back against it, breathing fast. "Bird," Daniel whispered in relief. "Where were you? I thought..." She raised a hand, sharply, stopping him. Her eyes darted around the room as though expecting soldiers to burst in. Then she crossed quickly to his desk and snatched the notebook. With urgent strokes, she drew a picture. Soldiers with sharp weapons, torches in the forest, fire between the trees. Daniel's chest tightened. "They're moving already?" She nodded, her expression grim. Then she drew another figure, a man with short hair, standing beside her people's symbol of peace. She pointed to him, then to Daniel. "You want me to go with you?" Daniel murmured. Her eyes softened and she nodded again. Daniel paced the room, his hands trembling. "If they catch me helping you, they'll throw me in the brig. They might even call me a traitor." He stopped and looked at her. "But if I don't, war will come." Bird stepped forward and gently tapped his chest again, right above his heart. Her smile was faint but steady. Daniel exhaled slowly. "All right, I'll help you." The following night, when most of the colony slept, Daniel slipped from his quarters with Bird at his side. He carried only a small pack, tools, water, and a little food. The security patrols were light near the western wall, where the searchlights barely reached. They moved like shadows, keeping close to the trees. Bird walked silently as always, her bare feet leaving no sound on the ground. Daniel stumbled a few times, unused to such stealth, but she steadied him with her hand each time. The forest swallowed them quickly. Silver branches arched high above, their leaves glowing faintly in the starlight. Strange bird-like creatures cried in the distance, their calls echoing like flutes. Daniel's heart pounded. He had never left the safety of the colony walls at night. Every crack of a twig felt like a soldier's boot behind him, but Bird moved without fear. She led him deeper, her steps certain, as if she had walked this path 100 times. Hours passed before they stopped at a small clearing. Bird knelt by a pool of water, scooping some into her hands. She gestured for Daniel to drink. He crouched beside her, staring at the reflection of the stars rippling across the surface. "You're not afraid of this forest, are you?" Daniel asked quietly. Bird shook her head. She pointed to the trees, then to her chest, then back to the trees again. "They're part of you," Daniel guessed. Her smile returned. Daniel drank from the pool, the water cold and sharp on his tongue. For a brief moment, the fear in his chest loosened. The calm did not last. As they continued deeper, the forest came alive with danger. At one point, Daniel stumbled across a patch of glowing vines. Before he could step back, they whipped upward, curling around his ankle like snakes. He cried out, trying to pull free. In an instant, Bird leapt forward. She grabbed a stone from the ground and smashed the vines apart, her movements quick and precise. She cut him loose, then pulled him away before more could rise. Daniel's chest heaved. "They're alive." Bird nodded, her eyes serious. She pressed her palm against his arm as if to calm him. Later they encountered something worse. A predator moving through the underbrush. Its eyes gleamed green in the starlight, and its body shifted low to the ground, muscles coiled. Daniel froze. The creature's growl was low and dangerous. Bird stepped in front of him. With slow, deliberate movements, she pulled a carved bone talisman from her robe and held it high. The predator's eyes locked onto it. For a tense moment, Daniel thought it would leap. But then, with a snarl, it backed away into the darkness. Daniel let out a shaky breath. "You saved me. Twice now." Bird only smiled, as if it had been nothing. By the time dawn began to touch the treetops, they reached a ridge overlooking a wide valley. Smoke rose faintly from a camp on the far side, tents and fires scattered across the grass. Bird pointed to it, her face solemn. "Your people," Daniel said softly. She nodded. Daniel stared at the camp. "What if they don't trust me? What if they think I'm just another human soldier?" Bird turned toward him, her eyes bright with quiet certainty. She reached out and clasped his hand in both of hers. No words, just the warmth of her grip. Daniel swallowed hard. Somehow her silence carried more strength than 1,000 promises. "All right," he said. "Let's do this." That night, as they camped by the edge of the ridge, Daniel finally spoke the words he had been holding back. "You know, when you first came into my quarters, I thought you were some kind of spy. I almost called security on you." He chuckled weakly. "But then you smiled, and for some reason I couldn't. It was like you were telling me not to be afraid." Bird watched him quietly, her smile soft. She reached for his notebook again and drew quickly by firelight. When she handed it back, Daniel's chest tightened. She had drawn 2 figures, one human, one of her kind, standing back to back with a circle of peace around them. Daniel looked at her. "Together?" She nodded. The firelight flickered across her face, and for the first time, Daniel allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, peace was possible, but deep down he knew the hardest part was still ahead. Her people would not welcome him easily, and his people would call him a traitor if they found out. He was caught between 2 worlds with no clear way out. Yet as Bird sat beside him, silent and steady, Daniel realized something important. He wasn't alone anymore, and sometimes that was enough to keep walking forward. The sun rose over the alien valley, painting the silver trees with gold. Daniel stood at the ridge with Bird beside him, looking down at the camp below. Smoke curled from the fires of her people, rising straight into the morning sky. From here, he could see figures moving, tall, robed, graceful. They looked strong, proud, and dangerous. His stomach tightened. "So this is it," he whispered. Bird nodded slowly. Her hand brushed against his, a small gesture of comfort. For a moment, Daniel wished they could stay on the ridge forever, safe in the quiet space between 2 worlds. But peace was never built on waiting. They began the descent. As they approached the outskirts of the camp, 2 alien guards appeared. They were taller than Bird, their faces stern, their spears gleaming in the light. They stepped forward, blocking the path. One barked words Daniel could not understand, sharp and suspicious. Bird raised her hand calmly and touched the symbol carved into her robe. The guards froze, their eyes widening. Then, as if recognizing her, they lowered their spears and gestured for her to pass. Daniel swallowed hard. "They know you." Bird didn't answer, but her calm expression told him everything. She wasn't just a wanderer. She belonged to someone important. The guards let them through, though their eyes never left Daniel. The camp was alive with activity. Children carried bundles of herbs. Elders sat weaving, warriors sharpened their blades. All of them paused when they saw Daniel. Whispers rose in the air, low and tense. Bird walked straight ahead, her steps certain. She led Daniel to the largest tent at the center of the camp. Outside it, elders and warriors gathered, their eyes sharp and distrustful. A tall figure stepped out of the tent. His robe was deep crimson, marked with symbols of authority. His presence was commanding, his gaze sharp as steel. He looked at Bird first, then at Daniel. The camp fell silent. Daniel felt his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to speak, but the weight of so many eyes silenced him. Bird stepped forward, bowing her head slightly. Then she touched her chest, then Daniel's, and finally drew the circle of peace in the air. The tall figure's eyes narrowed. An elder spoke, his voice deep. He addressed Bird in their language, his words rising like questions. Bird listened silently, then pointed to Daniel. She pressed her hand against her heart and smiled. Daniel stood frozen. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. She was saying she trusted him. She was saying he carried the same heart as theirs. The tall figure studied Daniel carefully. Then he spoke in halting, accented English. "Human, why are you here?" Daniel swallowed. His voice trembled, but he forced himself to speak. "I came because she showed me something better than war. She believes in peace, and so do I." The elder's gaze was piercing. "And what will your people say?" "They do not trust us." "They don't trust anyone," Daniel admitted. "But if you strike first, they'll never listen. And if we strike first, you'll never forgive. It has to start here, with us." For a long moment, no one spoke. The camp was still, waiting. Then Bird stepped forward. She touched the elder's hand gently, then drew again the circle of peace. Her smile was soft but unshaken. The elder exhaled slowly. At last he nodded. Relief washed through Daniel, but it didn't last long. That night, while the camp prepared for talks, a runner arrived from the forest. He spoke quickly to the elders, his voice urgent. Daniel couldn't understand the words, but he saw the fear in their faces. Bird grabbed Daniel's hand and pulled him toward the edge of the camp. She drew quickly in the dirt, human soldiers, torches, and weapons. They were coming. Daniel's blood ran cold. They followed us. Bird nodded, her face grave. The camp erupted in movement. Warriors armed themselves, children were rushed to safety, and the elders began preparing defenses. Daniel knew what was coming. One spark, and both sides would be at war. No, he whispered. Not like this. When the soldiers arrived at the valley's edge, they found Daniel standing in front of the camp. His arms were raised, his face pale but determined. Behind him, Bird stood silently, her hand resting on his shoulder. The commanding officer of the human troops stepped forward. Hayes, what in blazes are you doing here? Step aside. Daniel shook his head. If you fire, you'll kill her, people. And if they fight back, you'll kill each other. You'll burn everything we've built. They're a threat, the officer barked. We can't trust them. Daniel's voice broke, but he shouted anyway. I trust them, I trust her. He turned, looking back at Bird. She smiled at him, calm as always. That smile gave him strength. She walked into my life without a word. Daniel continued facing the soldiers again. She could have hurt me. She could have betrayed me. But instead she gave me peace. If she can trust me, why can't you trust her? The soldiers hesitated. Some shifted uneasily. The officer clenched his jaw, but he didn't give the order to fire. Behind Daniel, Bird stepped forward. She raised her hand high and drew the circle of peace in the air. The gesture was simple, but it carried power. For a long, tense moment, the forest was silent. Then slowly, the officer lowered his weapon. The days that followed were fragile but hopeful. Talks began between the elders and the human command. It was not easy. Arguments sparked, tempers flared, but the circle of peace was drawn again and again, each time reminding both sides what was at stake. And through it all, Bird stayed close to Daniel. She never spoke a word, but her presence was enough. One evening, as the talk stretched late into the night, Daniel sat by the fire with her. You changed everything, he said quietly. Without you, this place would already be ashes. Bird looked at him, her smile soft and radiant. She reached out and took his hand, holding it gently. For the first time, Daniel felt that maybe the war would not come. Maybe peace was truly possible. Weeks later, when the first agreement was signed, Daniel stood beside Bird at the edge of the camp. Humans and her people gathered together, cautious but hopeful. The elder who had first challenged Daniel stepped forward, raising his voice. Peace begins not with armies, but with hearts. It begins with those who dare to trust. The crowd murmured in agreement. Daniel looked at Bird. She met his gaze and smiled once more, the same smile she had given him on the very first night, when she had walked barefoot into his room, dropped her robe, and said nothing at all. And Daniel realized that smile had been enough to change his world.